Hi, welcome to Nina in the Kitchen, where today I'm making sourdough bread. This is a sourdough that I make for our everyday bread. I've worked this recipe out so that it's incredibly simple, very hands-off, but there's a saying that good bread takes time, not work, and that is very true of this bread. Of course, it's presumed that you already have a starter. In the meantime, people have been asking me how I make this bread, so I thought I would just show you. First of all, if I gave you some of my starter, just know that it always had unbleached flour in it. That's very important because chlorine can kill the little yeasty beasties that you want to grow, and also filtered water. So here are the ingredients. Very, very simple, and that's why I love this bread. All that it is flour. The yeast is a natural yeast, and here's my culture. This is called Bubbles. My niece named this, and it stuck because it's pretty obvious. It's rather bubbly and swampy looking. It smells really nice. This is a very healthy culture. Here I have some unbleached bread flour, and this may be called strong flour, but again, unbleached. This is a dark rye, and I will throw that in because it just keeps your culture very happy. Just a little bit of that, and it flavors your bread very well. I call this a country loaf since I'm using these three flours. This one is a white whole wheat. Of course, you can use a dark whole wheat or spelt, and you can mix this up any way you like. I have some kosher salt and filtered water. I'll tell you how to do this with cup measurements, but if I measure anything, and typically I don't, I will use my scale, and here's why. You put the scale on and everything goes in one bowl. You don't have these to wash. You don't have all the little things, the teaspoons and the half cups to wash. So it just makes it very easy. You're going to want 3/4 of a cup of your starter. This can weigh anywhere from 150 grams to about 200 grams, depending on how thick your starter is. I'm going 150 grams, that's about 3/4 of a cup. A lot of people will tell you to bring your starter out of the refrigerator, take some out, feed it, and let it sit for 5 hours, and then use it to make your dough. I don't do that because it's going to come down to room temperature anyway. And what are you doing when you're doing this is you're feeding the starter. So I bring it straight from the fridge, it's cold, and everything else about this will warm this up. This is my easy bread. This is 1.5 cups of water. That's 300 milliliters of water, 300 grams of water. And I'm just going to stir this up, just mix it up to get the starter incorporated into that water. Okay, this is a bread flour, and I'm going with 250 grams of this. Now, if you're going to use cup measurements, then what you want to do is fluff your flour, take a scoop, and after you've fluffed it, you take a scoop and then you pour it in. Flour gets compacted every time you take it out of your pantry and you put it down on something. You're compacting it every time. Okay, let's go. 250 grams. And then again, you stir this up. Now I'm going with 113 grams on the white whole wheat. And that is the equivalent of 1 cup of white whole wheat flour. 1.5 teaspoons of salt. This is a kosher salt. And this just gets stirred up. And I want 1/2 cup of rye flour in here. This is a dark rye, and I'm going with 55 grams on that. And the reason for the rye is it gives it a great texture, but also you'll notice that your yeast becomes incredibly active, or I should say your starter becomes very active when you add rye flour. And if you're going to add any seeds, you can do that now. Pumpkin seeds, sunflower seeds, sesame or flaxseed, any of those is delicious. I have some farro that I cooked up earlier, and I'm going to add about 1/2 cup to this dough. And at this point, I start using a knife because it's a little hard to push this around. You can use your mixer for this, or a food processor. I do this at nighttime and I don't feel like cleaning the bowl of anything, so I just go this way. Keep it all in the same bowl. So right now this bread is gloppy and it's kind of a mess. Typically when I make this bread, I know what this texture is and I do not do the measurements that I showed you. I just do it until it's like this. I take a lid, put it off to the side, and in a half hour we'll come back and you'll see how different this texture looks. So in the meantime, let me show you how I feed the starter. Here's my starter. I try to keep the sides of this dish clean. Now Bubbles has only about 2 tablespoons, well maybe 3, of starter left in there. So what I'm going to do is, this is not very scientific. You know, you can see a lot of videos where they show you 500 mils of this and 150 grams of that. And I don't do that because typically when I feed my starter is in the morning, I'm hanging over a cup of coffee. I don't want to get the scale out and do all of that. So here's what I do. It's a ratio of 1 part starter and maximum feed is 3 parts feed. A tablespoon, I just go, not very scientific, is it? 2, 3. I'll take a wheat and I'll take a white. And then I just take some water and I mix this up. So now I just have some water and I like my starter a little on the thick side. I just pour water in here and I mix it up. And again, I just go to where I like this to be as far as texture goes. I don't know the hydration on this and it really doesn't matter. It just seems to me that the starter does better when it's thicker. Then I take a wet paper towel and I clean up the sides. I think of this as a plant. If you were to purchase a plant and put it in one of your pots that you've bought, you want that pot to be clean, so you wash it first, right? And that's the same with this. I just take these sides and take all of that gunk off of the sides. After a very short while, and sometimes I take it just right from here and put it in the refrigerator. Other times I'll let it sit out and let it start to percolate, and then I put it in the fridge. If you let it go too long, though, that's when I've noticed that you start getting that black, some people call it hooch. It's black water that sits on top of the starter. I pour that off, if that's what happens, and mix it up. That's just byproduct. It's just waste from the starter breathing. So I don't even let it get there. As soon as it starts looking a little fluffy, a little percolating, it goes right in the fridge. And then to keep it, instead of snapping this lid down tight, I just place it loosely on the top, and that way all of the air that's trapped in here, that all the carbon dioxide can get out if it needs to, and that's it for the starter. A half hour's gone by. Here is our dough now. You can do this with your hand or you can do it with a spatula, but this is a technique called a stretch and fold. You pull your dough, you don't want to tear it, and then you just put it over on itself. I'm going to use my hands. It's easiest with a wet hand. You get underneath it, you stretch it out, and I just kind of shake it, and you flop it over on itself. But as you see now, it doesn't break at all. Instead of taking your dough out and kneading it, this is what you do. Now, typically, I do this at nighttime. When I know that the next morning I have time to bake, that's when I will make all of this. And the reason for that is that the next part of this bread is that this has to sit in this bowl, in this dirty bowl. It will sit here for anywhere from 12 to 18 hours. If your kitchen is 74 degrees, which is 23 Celsius, then this will be very happy in the morning, but it does need to rest for that amount of time. You could do this process before you go to work in the morning, and then when you come home in the evening, this is what you're going to have. This is a dough that I made last night. This is 12 hours old. You can see all the bubbles on the bottom of this bowl. I'll turn this around for you. It's nice and bubbly and happy, and you know, I don't know what the hydration is on this loaf because I typically don't measure. All these little dots that you see is the farro that I put in last night. And again, I take this and I stretch it. Look at this now. Pull it and flop it in on itself. And you just go around. Now, if you have time, you can do this at about the stretch and pull technique at about 30 to 40 minute intervals. And the more that you do it, the more bubbly, the more airy your dough will become. Just go around like this and then prepare for shaping the loaf. What you want to do is sort of give it a structure to grow into. You can use a banneton, and what that is a little wicker basket made especially for bread shaping, and the breads that come out of it are gorgeous. I don't have one because I don't want to store it, I don't want to clean it, so this is what I do. You can take just a regular bowl, just like this. I take a piece of parchment paper that's going to go in here, and I crinkle it up. When you crinkle it, this has a very malleable shape now, and furthermore, to soften it, I wet it. Crinkle it again, and now you can really mold this any way that you want. This is very easy to shape. Any extra water that happens, you just dump that out. The reason for choosing parchment is it makes life so easy because I'm going to use this enamel cast iron pot that you see in the back. If you buy one of these for baking bread, it's ideal to have one that does not have a plastic knob on it because that plastic is going to melt in a 500-degree oven, which is where we're going to go. So before heating your oven though, now this has to rise again. It really doesn't take long. Depending on your ambient temperature, my house is 74 degrees. That's 23 Celsius. You can go up higher than that. You can go a little lower than that. So the rising time will depend on that. This takes me an hour to an hour and a half for this bread to rise perfectly. And when we're there, I'll show you what that means. So now after one stretch and pull, I'm going to just put this dough right in here. I'm not adding flour to it. I'm not kneading it any more than this. I'm going to cover this, let this rise to about 80%. And I'll show you what that means when we get there. And I have a couple of tips for you. One is that before you turn your oven on, put your Dutch oven into the oven, which mine is. If you have an oven where you can see the heating coils, then what you might want to do is on the very bottom rack, put a pizza stone there. And what that does is it keeps an ambient heat going in your oven so that the bottom of your bread isn't dark brown while the top of it is golden brown. It'll keep the heat more even for you. The other thing I want to show you is how to tell when your bread is ready for the oven. This one is not, but it's an important lesson. Now this is a very sticky, wet dough, as you can see. I'm going to flour my finger very well and then press into the dough. And you'll see it comes right back up. The hole that I made has filled in. What that means is that this bread is underproofed. You don't want to put this in when it's underproof because what will happen is the middle of your bread will be very dense and the periphery of the bread is going to be beautiful and exactly what you want. So underproofing, no bueno. I'm going to start my oven because when the temperature comes up, I want to make sure that that Dutch oven is truly going to be really blazing hot. So oven goes on. Bubbles, which has started to bubble already. As you can see, she looks a little fluffier, right? So Bubbles is going back to her home in the fridge. And at this point, what you're doing is you're slowing down the yeast growth. You're kind of putting it to sleep. It'll be dormant. So now I'm going to snap the lid on. And back she goes. And I'll see you when this is ready. I think this is ready to go into the oven, and let me show you how I test it. You want it to be about 80% risen. When I think it's ready, I'm going to just sprinkle some flour on this, And that's really just to give it some appeal, just to make it look rustic when it comes out. Again, take your finger, push into the dough, and now you'll see it springs back, but not all the way. And I don't know if you can still see the dent in there. I'll try it over here. Gently push in, and you'll see it doesn't quite come back all the way. That is perfectly proofed and ready to go into the oven. If you put it in and it doesn't come back whatsoever, then that's overproofed. And what happens with overproofed bread is that when you bake it, it puffs up, it wants to puff, and it can't, and it collapses on itself. So you have a flat top to it, if you will. And you know, no matter how your bread bakes, whether you get a perfect loaf or an imperfect loaf, you can eat this and it will always be really delicious. I encourage you to bake bread. Let's get this in the oven. My pot has been in there for a good, 30 minutes, where it was already up to temp, waiting for this guy to proof perfectly. I'm going to bring that out. Let me just get the pot. I'll be right back. And now I'm going to just score this. I have a double-edged razor blade on a chopstick, and I'm going to cut into this. But you do want to slash it just to control where exactly this bread is going to spring when it's in the oven. When this goes into the oven, this will puff up in the final baking, and that is what is called oven spring. I don't know if you heard that, but you could hear a sizzling when that went in. Okay, this goes back on. That has gone into the oven with the lid on, and it will bake that way at 500 degrees, which is 260 Celsius, for 30 minutes. At 30 minutes, I take the lid off. I turn the oven down to 475, which is 245 Celsius, and I just let it bake. You want it to be about 190 degrees if you take the temperature. I do the thump method. If it sounds hollow, the bread is done. You can get, some people like it to be a really dark mahogany color. Anywhere from golden brown to that deep mahogany, it's done, and it's so delicious. I'm already getting anxious to get this bread out of the oven. This came out of the oven. It went on a cooling rack, and now it's completely cooled down. And unfortunately, you do have to wait, because that is part of the baking process. If you cut into bread right away, all of the air that you've built up in it will come out. It'll get squished down as you cut it, and it doesn't taste very good. You really want to let it cool completely, unfortunately. And let's just see what this looks like. It has a crackly crust. Sourdough doesn't taste sour. It tastes complex. And it's just, I think, the best bread that you can ever taste, and it's one that you can't buy easily. And there's the crumbs. Isn't that beautiful? We have some open holes. This is nice and moist. And another thing about sourdough is that it does not mold easily. So you can keep this out on your counter and it won't go bad. It's an amazing product. I hope that you tried this recipe if you have a starter. In the meantime, enjoy. Bye, guys.